Welcome to Thrive Deeper, an ongoing conversation with Dr. Matthew Jacoby, author of the Thrive Bible Reading Guides, teaching pastor and leader of the Psalmist band Sons of Korah. Join us as we go deeper into the Bible, discussing the passages as we read them together with Thrive. Now here's your host, DJ Payne.
G'day, it's DJ here, and I just want to say a big thanks for joining us on episode 3 of Thrive Deeper. Now, this discussion between Matt Jacoby and myself is a really great one, if I do say so myself. It's where we get into the book of Ezekiel, everything up to chapter 33, that first half of the book, and we look at the themes that we've already discussed. That is, that God's telling his people that, I told you this was going to happen. I told you what would happen, and not that you would be rejected by me, but that you'd come back to me, that I want to have a relationship with you. And we look into that, and that gets us into a deep discussion into forgiveness and restoration as part of God's plan. Now, I was really blessed to be part of this conversation. I think you'll hear that, and it's our prayer and hope that you would be blessed as you listen to the conversation with me and Matt, as you read through the book of Ezekiel. Now, there is so much exciting stuff happening behind the scenes. The Thrive Today team are working on some fantastic stuff. Cannot wait to be releasing all of this stuff to you. So keep listening after the conversation. I'll be back and let you know more about it. But that's enough from me for now. After the break, you can join me and Matt in conversation. All right, so when we were talking last time, we were, covering off, we're in the flow of Ezekiel where the judgments, and it's getting darker and darker and darker and darker for Jerusalem, for Judah, and everything like that. We've seen, the pronouncements get worse and worse. We've seen the glory leave the temple. We've seen God keep on using through Ezekiel the idea that a marriage covenant has been broken, that something very sacred, a promise has been broken by them. God's heart is breaking. What's next in this process?
Well, the important thing there is that because of this, there is this rupture. There is this rupture in the relationship, and Ezekiel, the darkness is that as Ezekiel is announcing that Jerusalem's going to be decimated. That theme finishes, of course, when Jerusalem is decimated. So that message, that message just keeps coming to them right up to the point, so that when it happens, that they will know that God has spoken it and that he is God and that he said it beforehand. I told you this would happen. And hopefully by the point that it does happen, they will be in a position to understand why it's happened. By the time the messenger comes to the exiles, which is what happens in what we read about in Ezekiel 33, by that stage, they understand this is why this has happened.
Okay. It's not, and we'll get there when we get there. This is probably going to be in the next week or so when we get to that fantastic period. Yeah. But on the way there, when God, I know that sometimes when we read this phrase, and then you will know, we put a human element to it. It's almost like you just said. It's more like we sort of go, it's not, I told you so. No. It's not God standing there with folded arms going, I told you so. You didn't listen. It's
him saying, I want you to know that I'm God, right? Yeah. And when this happens, you'll remember what I've said. You'll remember the promises. You'll remember, and it's all with the goal of getting them to realize that actually God is sovereign over this. Yeah. He's the one that directs the future.
I was funny in reading this week through it. I was, thinking about a lot of the passages in that, and some other stuff that I've been looking at and studying at the moment has all been about shame. About the concept of shame. And it was tying in perfectly with what we're reading with Ezekiel. There's that sense that. Not that God is trying to shame them, but he's trying to alert them to what's actually going on. And then I ended up in 2 Corinthians. I think it's chapter 7, where Paul is talking to the church at Corinth after the really hard letter we get in 1 Corinthians. And there's been other letters that he's been writing to the Corinthians. And then he gets into the middle of chapter 7 and he talks about that old school phrase that I grew up with, this, the sorrow that leads to repentance.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Paul talking about that's the reason why he's doing, and it's to point them back to God. And I was like, man alive, this is echoing yet again what Ezekiel's talking about.
And that's an important point, because it sounds quite harsh when he says that in that day you will realize what you've done. He said there's a number of points where he says this. You'll realize what you've done and you will loathe yourselves. Read that. Hang on, sort of modern psychology.
Yeah.
Like that's not good terrible. For your self-esteem. Yeah, that's not good for your self-esteem. And whereas actually, clearly in Ezekiel, that's a desirable end, and it's not about.
It doesn't end there.
Yeah, it's not rejecting your inherent sense of worth.
No,
it's owning what you have done. It's actually realizing the extent of your guilt and feeling the shame. Shame is that experience of guilt, that sense of being. Of realizing under the gaze of God how far we've fallen from what we were meant to be. And that's the key thing in Ezekiel. You were meant to be this. You were meant to be a light to the nations, but you are going to be an object of horror and scorn to the nations. And then you will know, right? And then you will know, then you'll realize, and you will loathe yourselves. In other words, you will loathe what you have become. And he wants them to loathe what they've become, because he wants to change that.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
He wants to lead them on from that. So, so that I think is a really good connection actually with what Paul says there, because he is constantly wanting to bring us to that point where we take responsibility for the guilt and the dysfunction and all that is bad in our lives, so that we can take responsibility for that and move on. So that's why that theme is so strong there in that first part of Ezekiel.
Yeah. And I think it's important to sort of keep that end view in mind, because if we sort of stop reading now, we get lost in that sense of shame.
Yeah.
And shame is such a powerful thing in so many people's lives today, because if we don't deal with it in the right way, or we don't keep reading, I think that's a real good place where we end up.
Yeah, and that's a really important point, because it isn't as though God wants us to live in this state of constant shame. He wants us to experience forgiveness. This is the point. He wants us to experience forgiveness and restoration. But in order for us to experience forgiveness and restoration, we have to face the depth of what we've done. And that's the experience when he says, and then you will loathe yourselves. And he's not saying that the ideal state of spirituality is that we do this constant woe is me routine. Yeah. No, he wants us to move forward, but we have to take responsibility to do that. So that's the idea there.
It's a healthy balance.
Yeah.
It's a healthy balance. Okay. So moving on from there, as we marching down to this dark point, Ezekiel, what does Ezekiel see next? That God's doing.
Well, there's an interesting moment in chapter 20 actually, when the elders come to Ezekiel. So they're living together in an area in Babylonia, and the elders are coming. They recognize that Ezekiel is a prophet, so they're constantly coming to him. And they come to him to inquire of the Lord, right? Because they want to know what's going on, what's happening, they're really, you can imagine their confusion and their uncertainty and their sense of insecurity, and there are so many questions that they have, right? So they come to Ezekiel with all of these questions to inquire of the Lord, right? And God says to Ezekiel, they've come to inquire of me, but tell them, no, I'm not going to let them inquire of me.
Wow.
And you think, hang on, isn't it good that they've come to inquire of God? Well, yes, in a way, but they're still in this mode of inquiry that is something like the practice that was common in the ancient Near East, where you would go you would consult the omens.
Yeah.
You
like you go to a shaman or the witch doctor, that's or the holy person.
So you would go to the prophet in ancient Near Eastern terms, meant the guy that cut open the animal and practiced ectasy, which is the practice of observing the entrails to determine the future. Now, as a footnote, I may add, actually, there's one point, and I forget the chapter right now. It's when he's talking about Babylon, chapter 21, where he says that Nebuchadnezzar is going to come to a fork in the road and he's going to decide between two cities, and he's going to consult the omen, and he's going to practice ecstasy. So he's going to, consult the entrails. And God says, I'm going to cause it to point towards Jerusalem.
Wow.
So that he goes and attacks Jerusalem.
Wow.
So it's interesting as a footnote that God even works through that means to get things where he wants them to go. So, I mean, that's interesting. But at this stage, they're almost approaching God a little like this. Yeah. We want to get the information. We want to see the future. We want to find out what's happening. Like we're consulting the oracle kind of thing. And God's saying, no, we're not going to do that. No. Why? Because you need to know that I'm God. And like, you're coming to me with all of these questions, but I've been trying to talk to you. Yeah. I've been trying to talk to you all of this time, right? And until you listen to what I'm trying to tell you, I'm not going to answer any of those other questions. In fact, you're not going to even be in a position to understand any answers to those questions until you actually listen to what I'm saying to you. So this is God saying, yeah, we're going to have a conversation, but it's going to be on my terms.
Wow.
I'm not going to come down and be your oracle and your omen giver and your God with a small g like the other gods. No, I am the Lord. I'm going to be God to you or nothing else. So we're going to have this conversation, because then, he goes on, and he says, then the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, speak to the elders of Israel and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says, it's just, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Have you come to inquire of me? As surely as I live, I will not let you inquire of me, declares the sovereign Lord. And he means in that case, I'm not going to let you inquire of me just like I'm some kind of oracle. And then he says to Ezekiel, will you judge them? Will you judge them, son of man? Then confront them with the detestable practices of their ancestors and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. So God, it's not that he doesn't want to speak to them. He's just saying, I'm not going to have this conversation on my terms. Now, the other interesting thing here is that taking responsibility for them means not just taking responsibility for what they've done. They actually have to take responsibility for what their ancestors did.
Yes. Yeah.
Now that's an interesting concept, because we tend to think far too individualistically. Whereas in a biblical worldview, while we're not directly held guilty for the sins of our ancestors, we are nevertheless, there's an element of responsibility that we must take, in as much as we have to take responsibility for each other. Cain's question, am I my brother's keeper? Well, yeah, in a way. Yeah. Everyone is responsible for everyone. And so, that's the biblical worldview. And so, the standard confession, as the Psalm says, and I think it's Psalm 107, 106 maybe, where it says, we have sinned, Lord, even as our fathers did. So that's the standard formula for confession, is recognizing not only what I've done, but recognizing that I am walking in a pattern of practice that was established long before.
So it's not that it's sort of like, in a simple way, when the elders come and they want to inquire of Ezekiel and God gives them this, it's not that Ezekiel's saying God's not talking, but it's almost like, hold on, we've got to deal with this issue.
We've got to deal with this issue first. Yeah, that's right.
It's almost, again, in that relational way that he's just coming off the back of talking of a marriage. Yeah. It's almost having a cheating husband come and wanting to move on, and you go, hang on, we have to deal with this first.
Exactly, yeah.
And that's what God is saying. Yeah, God is saying, no, this is the agenda we're talking about, and until you're ready to talk about this, there will be no further.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, so the elders, do the elders hear that message?
Look, I think I think it does get through. Now this is all reading from history.
Yeah.
Something got through to these people.
Now, again, these are, just to reiterate, in case anybody's coming late or forgetting, we're talking about Ezekiel, the prophet, and the exiles that are already in Babylon.
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
We're talking about this group here.
Yeah.
That almost, it's almost in a sense that God, even though they're in captivity, God has spared them.
Yeah.
God has got them there as a remnant.
Yeah, that's right. So, and in fact, he's already referred to that through Ezekiel. He's already said to Ezekiel, I'm going to spare some, because it has those oracles where it says, to a third of them, this is going to happen. To a third of them, that's going to happen. And the other third, this is going to happen. And it's all judgment. You think, hang on, there's no one left.
Yeah.
But because you think, well, that's the maths isn't very good, but actually he's also saying, but I am sparing a remnant. Actually, and they were the remnant. They're in exile, and there's a few thousand of them at this point, and they're going to be joined by another probably about another 10,000 after 586, after the city is destroyed. There's another whole lot that come into exile, but at this point up to chapter 33. There's that deportation from Jerusalem that Ezekiel was part of, that was sent into exile.
Yes.
So that's that few thousand. So they're all living there. The people of Judah, they're living there. They're in exile. Now, at some point, clearly the message got through, because actually the nation that emerges after 539 BC, the nation that comes out of exile the other side, never turns to idols again. I mean, well, not in that form.
Yes.
Not in the form that previously was. It's actually a completely redefined people.
Yeah.
And they are willing to leave what were actually livelihoods, in a lot of cases quite good livelihoods in Babylon, because they made lives for themselves there. They were prepared then, after decades, to leave everything and go back into uncertainty on the strength of the oracles of Ezekiel and Daniel and the visions of Daniel, to go back and be a part of the purpose of God.
And I think that's an important point, to zoom out and have a look at that bigger picture that we are blessed to have, because we are living in this year now, and look back in history and go, that part of this process that God is doing through Ezekiel is to build a foundation of a new relationship.
That's right. Yeah.
This is foundational parts of a new relationship that he's going through. So even though it sounds harsh, there's a hope coming.
Yeah, that's right. And this is, a lot of the visions in the second half of Ezekiel are pointing forwards, to that period, to a new people of God. And that begins to be fulfilled with the return. So, as I said, that's to underscore the fact that something significant happened among these people. They really did cry out to God. There's some amazing psalms actually written during this period, Psalm 130, probably an exilic psalm. Out of the depths I cry to you. Look, it's some real amazing heart cries come out of this time. They did seek God. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. This is them weeping and pouring out their hearts like water before the Lord, as Jeremiah tells them to do in Lamentations chapter 2.
So it's a powerful time.
It's a powerful time, actually. And I wish we knew more. Actually, I wish there was more information that we had about that process.
Yeah. Okay, so looking ahead, you mentioned it before, like we're coming out of chapter 20, looking at 21, and we've mentioned it a few times, but let's really drill down into this. And this is a hard concept for us to get through in our modern minds. Yeah. But in the big picture, God, in God's hand as his tool, was Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon.
Yeah.
Babylon is called, I think in 21, the sword.
The sword of God's judgment. Yeah.
That is incredible because and it doesn't let Nebuchadnezzar or the Babylonians off from any judgment, but the fact that God today can be using world governments, nations in his plan, and we might think of these people as the enemy or the other. Yeah. God's like, I've got it all under control here. This is going to my plan.
Yeah, so the message of Jeremiah, for example, is constantly, you need to go with this. You need to submit to the king of Babylon because he's my, he's my emissary. He's the sword of my discipline on you. And in fact, it's going to say the same thing about Cyrus. Isaiah says the same thing about Cyrus, who sets the people free in 539 at the end of their exile. He refers to Cyrus as my servant. This is, again, an expression of the fact that God is God. He is the sovereign Lord over all of the earth. And he uses the nations. And in this case, he's using Nebuchadnezzar. Now, the interesting thing is here, as you said, this doesn't let Nebuchadnezzar off the hook. No. This doesn't mean that, therefore, everything that Nebuchadnezzar does is right. Actually, Nebuchadnezzar has to face judgment himself. And actually, when we get to talking about Daniel, which is the next book that we're going to read,
we see that, yeah.
We see that Nebuchadnezzar ends up going mad and eating grass like an animal.
Let me, if you haven't got there yet, we'll hear from Nebuchadnezzar himself.
Yeah, that's right.
We'll actually get his own very words.
Yes, we'll get his testimony about how God humbled him. So
it is fascinating.
Yeah, it is. And there are these judgments on Babylon as an empire, for all of, it's not just about Nebuchadnezzar, but that Babylon's going to be destroyed. In fact, we're told that it will be destroyed in one day without a battle. And of course, that's exactly what happens. Yeah. Cyrus finds a sneaky way into the walls and takes over the city at night. So they're still held accountable, but even the wrongdoing and the cruelty of a nation like Babylon that's just bent on ambition and taking over the world and being like, God's going to use that.
Yeah.
In some paradoxical way, God says, they're doing it for this reason, but I'm going to use it for this reason. This is the paradox of God's sovereignty at work.
And look, I want to get really specific. I was reading, because I was literally reading this morning, and we're not getting political here at all.
Yeah.
But we're living in mid 2018.
Yeah.
All right. Love him or hate him.
Oh, you're going to be careful.
I'm going there. I'm going to go there. Love him or hate him. Donald Trump, the American president, in 2018, the president of the USA. Now, I'm not assuming any. I'm not coming out one side or another. But let's assume the worst about his motivation, and where his heart's at. And again, I'm painting this as a picture. He might. An aide might come to him and say, "You've got a great television op, a chance at the Nobel Peace Prize. We can free some North Korean prisoners, fly out here, and we bring them home and everything like that. Fantastic. Let's assume the very worst of why he's doing that. But meanwhile, God has got 3 North Korean Christian pastors who were jailed for praying out of North Korea. Like, God is at work despite what we see. And wherever our political persuasion is, whoever's in charge, God is doing something behind the scenes.
There's a lot of, it's a good point, because there's a lot of uncertainty in the world. And I experience this sometimes through the eyes of my children who get wind of, world events and Kim Jong and Trump and Syria and Russia and the world, the world seems so uncertain. But it's wonderful to be able to say, over all of this, God is sovereign. And if we walk in the pathway of God, then we are on a sure thing. It doesn't mean that life is going to be easy for us.
No.
But it is a sure thing. God's purpose is going to triumph.
Yeah.
That's the important thing. And that's what comes through Ezekiel. It's what comes through all of the prophets, what finally comes through the book of Revelation. Yeah. That despite what's happening in world events, God is sovereign, and he's going to move everything in his sovereign and even paradoxical way to where he's
and this
going.
is why I love the book of Ezekiel, because it shows us a bigger narrative. We get lost in the moments of time that we're stuck in. But we see a bigger story being told. And I love this whole thing about Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon being used.
And this is probably the point, maybe just to mention. I know we're jumping forward, and there's a couple of things we might want to jump back into.
Yeah.
But right in the middle of Ezekiel, there are these oracles about the nations and God's judgment upon all of the nations. We've noted in the last episode how it says that, and then it says, and then they will know that I'm God. So even their judgment. And you think, did that go out, because he's talking to these nations, but the fact is those nations like Philistia and Tyre and Sidon and Egypt and Ammon and all of these nations that he talks to, they would never have heard that prophecy. But this is,
you don't know. Exactly.
But actually the audience for that actually was the people of Judah in exile.
Yeah.
Because they're saying, what about these other nations? And he said, I'm going to deal with those other nations, to the end that they would know that I am God. But right now I'm dealing with you, and I'm dealing with your issues.
Yeah. Fully. Okay, so marching through as we're heading through, again, that idea of there a bigger picture, but we actually have to live through life, and it's not always rosy for the follower.
No.
Now, Ezekiel is a prophet of God, knowing God in an intimate way that we couldn't imagine, like the way that God is using him. But then we get a really sad moment, a reality check in Ezekiel the prophet's life.
Yeah.
His wife.
Yeah, she dies. And God says to Ezekiel, you're not allowed to mourn her. It seems outlandish. I actually remember when I first read that, I thought, that's terrible. For all that Ezekiel's done, now are you going to be that, it's like cruel to Ezekiel.
Did Ezekiel, surely Ezekiel's heart must have been breaking in that moment.
Yeah. Now,
because he mentions his wife earlier, doesn't he? Like earlier in the book, he mentions something about her, how she supported him or something. If I got that wrong?
I'm not sure about
But they were
that.
together at least. I mean,
that's right. They were there together, and she dies in exile, which obviously would have been terrible for Ezekiel. Now, throughout the book, we have this pattern of Ezekiel himself embodying a message. Yeah. He has to lie on his side. He has to shave his head. He has to, it just goes on and on and on, all the things that he has to do. He has to dig through a wall,
He builds a little model of it.
He has to demonstrate the message. And so they're getting used to this thing. And what is Ezekiel doing now? Yeah. Like, he's doing all of these strange things, and it's to get through in the most impacting form, Ezekiel demonstrating the message. Now, in this case, it's actually not that Ezekiel isn't allowed to grieve. It doesn't say that he's not allowed to grieve. Okay. What God is saying is that I don't want you to go through the standard forms of mourning,
like the ritual that
the rituals would do. Yeah. Okay. And there were rituals that required time. It was like a standard month of mourning and things that you would do.
Yes.
And God is saying to Ezekiel, I'm not going to let you do that because I want to show them what's about to happen. And what's about to happen in Jerusalem is that there's about to be a bloodbath, and they're going to be sent into exile. They're not going to have time to mourn the dead. The dead are going to be left there unburied. And they're not going to have time to go through the customary time of mourning because they're going to be taken into exile. So it's saying to Ezekiel that he needs to demonstrate this. So you can grieve privately, God is saying, but I don't want you to go through the ceremonies, the customary ceremonies of mourning. So they find out Ezekiel's wife has died, but he's not going through, he's not wearing the right clothes, and he's not sitting in ashes. He's not doing all the things that are customary.
And especially not the things that a righteous, holy man would be doing.
Yeah, that's right. Especially
they've got to follow these laws, and they've got to follow this. Yeah.
And so, and then they come, why are you doing this? And then the message comes across. It's because actually, in this case, Ezekiel is embodying what's happening to what's about to happen to everyone else. What's happening to Ezekiel? Being bereaved but unable to go through the proper mourning, that's exactly what's just about to happen to the people in Jerusalem.
That's powerful. Okay, so as we wrap up, let's wrap up, for this part here where we're going to, is there any other thought that we want to leave now in the book of Ezekiel as we're heading into the next part, as we're heading into this darkest period?
Well, probably just one topic, I think, in the midst of the oracles to the nations. I think it's worth saying something about this as we move away from this first half of Ezekiel. And that is this strange reference to the king of Tyre and the way that the king of Tyre is characterized. I'll read it. It says in chapter 28, in the pride of your heart you say, I am a god. I sit on the throne of God in the heart of the seas, but you are a mortal, not a god. And then it goes on, and it says further on, it refers to, and I haven't got the exact section in front of me.
That's okay.
Here, but it talks about him being. It characterizes him like Satan.
Yes.
As we move on, and a lot of people have asked this oracles about the king of Tyre, and you were an angel and adorned in glory, and it even refers to the king of Tyre as a cherub, the guardian cherub of the Garden of Eden. It says you were in Eden, and it talks about his pride and how he coveted, and so is it talking about the king of Tyre, or is it talking about
Satan?
It's talking about Satan. Well, it's actually talking about both, and in fact, Ezekiel. I actually printed out the wrong text here.
That's right.
But he's actually connecting. He's characterizing the king of Tyre in terms of Satan himself.
Wow.
So the kind of pride that the king of Tyre is experiencing, and this godlike, because he claims to be a god. This is actually the same. This is actually the same as what happened with Satan, and so it actually, I think we can say that it does say something behind the scenes about what actually happened back there at the start. That at the fall. I mean, it talks about Satan as being the guardian cherub of the Garden of Eden, and that arrayed in glory as an angel of God, and yet experienced this opportunity to come out from under God, deceive the man and the woman, and start a rebellion with them away from God. But in that sense, hide behind the man and the woman, because Satan, Satan sees that they are given this realm of earth as their dominion, and what they say goes. So he tricks them into essentially giving him permission to stay on the earth, and so it's an interesting insight into this spiritual reality behind things. And it reminds us, I'll just say this too, it reminds us actually that behind, I mean, we've just talked about behind the to and fro of the nations, there is the sovereignty of God. But the other thing that's behind the nations, the to and fro of the nations, is the work of the evil one, of Satan. It was a reality there as well. And ultimately what we see in Revelation is the nations being inspired, as it were, by Satan himself, and God triumphing over the work of Satan.
Do you think Ezekiel and the listeners and the readers understood and saw that as a? Do you think they just kept it literal or that, or how early did the Jews see this as talking about the evil one, or was it later?
He seems to have in view. He has in view Genesis. Yeah. So they had that. So that's what he's referring, because he refers you were in Eden. So there is that background knowledge to make sense of this. And so they're thinking back, Eden, Satan tempting the. Yep. So they had that background to make sense of it. Okay. What more they had, we don't know, because actually what we've got is as much scripture as there was up to this point, which was at this stage just the Torah, just the first 5 books of the Bible.
So it's one of those moments again where one passage can be saying two different things.
Yeah. But explicitly the case. I mean, we need to be careful about that. Otherwise, we can make any passage say anything. Yeah. In this case, it's explicitly the case that that one thing is being used as a type of another thing. Now, this happens a lot in prophecy, particularly messianic prophecies, where I'm talking about this, but there's this double element to this.
It gets me so excited when we see glimpses of the Messiah, the messianic prophecies that are buried in Ezekiel, both subtly and then very explicitly as God speaks through Ezekiel. Isn't it fantastic? I hope you had a great time listening to that. We'll be back next week. But before you go, make sure you visit thrivetoday.net. If you're hearing this through some other link or someone has shared it through, or you found it through iTunes, make sure you head over to our website, thrivetoday.net.au. We are working very hard on it behind the scenes to make it a destination that you want to come back to. Bookmark it and keep subscribed there. It's also a great way to get questions to us. You can get questions directly to us through the website. If you've got anything that you're reading through in the Thrive booklets and you want to get them to us, that's the best way. All right, I'm DJ Payne and I'll talk to you next week.
Thanks for listening to Thrive Deeper. If you have questions you would like answered, contact us on Facebook at facebook.com/thrivedeeper or at the Thrive Today website, where you can also subscribe to the Thrive Daily Bible Reading Guide. That's at thrivetoday.net.au. Until next time, thrive.